Welcome to the third event in our Inside Story series. At our first event, we invited a male lens and asked leaders, given the macho culture of the city, what drove them to become ambassadors for mental health? At our second event, we invited female perspectives and asked leaders, what are the challenges faced by leaders that sponsor the mental health agenda, and is that different for women? At our next event, we're going to seek perspectives of leaders from the trans community. But today, we continue the gendered theme and once again invite male perspectives on intersectionality and mental health. We are pleased to welcome 4 fantastic panelists. We've got Lee Hodgkinson, CEO of OSTC Limited, a highly successful global trading business operating from 12 offices around the world. We have Abihijay Jain. Abihijay is a tax partner at PwC, as well as being a mental health advocate. He is an active campaigner for well-being at work. We have Will Black. Will is an in-house financial PR specialist at Deloitte, covering HR and talent. He is also the events lead for Globe at Deloitte, helping people be themselves at work. And we have Matt Cameron. Matt is the CEO of LGBT Great. Matt launched LGBT Great in 2017, a member organization with a vision to create LGBT plus inclusion within the global investment industry. So before we go to hear from our panels, I'd first like to frame the context of this discussion today. What is intersectionality and how does it relate to mental health in the workplace? So what is intersectionality and how does it relate to mental health in the workplace? Intersectionality is the overlapping maps of our identity, which include gender, race, social mobility, sexual orientation, age, health, and class. It's influenced by our environment, experiences, and relationships. It aligns with the concept of being authentic and feeling like you can bring your whole self to work. It's about the implications on our mental health if we live and work in environments where we have to hide parts of our identity. BAME communities, for example, are less likely, or BAME employees are less likely to seek help at work. LGBTQ employees are disproportionately represented with poor mental health. 71% of carers have poor physical and mental health. So how do we create a culture in workplaces that foster inclusion, respect diversity, and what impact does that have on business? Let me first turn to Lee and ask you this question. Lee, tell us why you have chosen to create a mentally healthy and inclusive workplace, and what impact do you foresee that's having on your business?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a cliche, but I suppose cliches, exist for a reason, right? And the cliche is that people are any organization's most valuable asset. We've got 500 employees worldwide, every race, every religion, creed, color, you name it. We've got a very diverse organization. We're a young organization. 80% of our employees are under 40 and 50% are under 30. And we operate, I guess, in the trading business at the sharp end of what has traditionally been a dominated white alpha male business. And what we realize is that if we are to survive and prosper as a company over the long term, we have to have an open and inclusive environment for our employee community across the globe. You use words like holistic and authentic, and I think that's absolutely right. And to be candid, I think that we haven't had that. And we want to change, and we have to change. And the reason is that it's not you know, a moral crusade. I don't see myself, or our leadership don't see ourselves as the moral arbiters of what's right and what's wrong. You know, although of course I feel strongly about these things. It's not my job to tell people, you know, what's right and what's wrong, but it is my job to make sure the company operates on sound business logic. And a diverse and inclusive workforce, for me, does three things that are very important. Firstly, it encourages employees to be themselves. People that feel that can be themselves are more comfortable, they're happier. They typically operate at their peak potential. Secondly, diversity and inclusion avoids groupthink and promotes better decision making and lowers risk. We learned that in the financial crisis, it's self-evident. And of course, thirdly, a positive environment helps you attract and retain the best talent. So one of the things I always look at is, with those three clear business benefits, I'm sure the experts on this panel will tell me there are even more, why would you not want that? I mean, it's, to me, would be ridiculous not to pursue that. So we're very, very much driving our change from a business perspective. Now, if we look at some of the data, we had to have a long look in the mirror at what we found, and we had to be very honest and authentic with ourselves to really accept we weren't doing a good enough job. So we began last year with a drive for greater gender diversity. We felt that was the right place for us to start, and the results were good. You know, 50% of new hires at the company in our support and corporate services are female. We've got that number up to 17% in the first quarter in the markets business, on the trading floors. Lots of work still to be done, but I'm very pleased that we've made you know, such a positive start. But in our global staff survey at the end of last year, we found that 4.5% of our employees identified as having a different sexual orientation, and 7% preferred not to say. So that meant that we have around 50 employees who, for one reason or another, are not comfortable in openly being themselves when they're in the workplace. Now, obviously, for some people, not disclosing their sexual orientation is a choice, and we respect that, and that's perfectly legitimate, of course. But the problem arises when employees feel that they are unable to do so for fear of discrimination or for whatever reason. And that was a wake-up call for me and our leadership team, because until very recently, we had no openly LGBT employees in our company, yet the survey was telling us otherwise. And that upset me, to be perfectly honest. It really disturbed me that I was running an organization where people felt that way. And I felt very passionate that meant I was underperforming, and that we were underperforming as a leadership team, not just in the environmental and the duty of care to our employees, but from a commercial perspective as well, because of the reasons I've outlined. And it didn't align with our values and who we are as people, and where we want to drive our company from a purpose, vision, and values perspective. So we decided to do something about it, and that started, you know, all of this stuff coincided with lockdown. We started by prioritizing our approach to lockdown, putting people first. So our priorities for lockdown are keep our people safe, keep our people employed, and remain profitable, because you can't be profitable unless you're taking care of the people side of things. And then we've redoubled our efforts to make the company a place where everybody can be themselves, despite lockdown. We hired Faiza Tahir as a D&I, a wellness lead. She's been incredible and made a massive positive impact to the organization, and I think started to redefine how we think about all of these things in ways that we didn't imagine possible. She was our first lockdown virtual onboarding hire. It went brilliantly and showed what people can do. And today we are announcing that we're taking a big step to explicitly welcome and include the LGBT community by signing up to Stonewall's Diversity Champions Partnership. Next week, we do a lot more on mental health to coincide with Mental Health Week. And, you know, we're just at the beginning of this, and I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it, but we are very, very committed to driving the change from a commercial perspective. So, you know, this is why I'm here today to send that message.
So one of the things, I'm going to move to Abihijay in a second, but I just want to ask you, Lee, when we spoke, you talked about putting health and well-being as part of your governance structure and not hate.
Can you just share that with us?
Yeah, so we, as part of our overall strategic plan, we have governance as our center of gravity. And what that means is that, you know, that is the primary root of all activity in the company. So when we're making a trade-off or a choice strategically, or we're making any kind of decision, we start from the perspective of governance, and we include diversity, inclusion, and wellness as part of that governance stream. Because again, why would you think about it differently? It is an inherently important and intrinsic process tied to managing risk in every shape or form. So we made that decision very early on, and that means that when we're allocating resources, you know, we protect the money, we protect the people that are making those, taking those programs forward, because we see it as part of our risk, compliance, and governance culture, not just something that HR tips up and says, hey, you know, we think we should be doing a little bit better. Because it doesn't work, right? It's got to be owned by the business, it's got to come from the top, but every single leader across the organization, across the globe, needs to take that to heart and have it as part of the core governance process.
So Lee, I think that was the most inspiring part of the conversation we had for me when we met, was the fact that you've made this a governance and a risk issue, which I think many organizations don't do and treat it as a sideline. Abihijay, let me come to you now and ask you, how do you think intersectionality should be implemented within the workplace health and well-being agenda? And also, Abihijay, you and I first came across you through the PwC Faith Network, and the This Is Me film that was created. And I'm really interested to hear how that network has supported you and your colleagues in your journey of becoming a mental health advocate.
Thank you, Poppy. Why don't I sort of give you a bit of sort of my story, and I'll sort of weave in my reflections as I go along. So I think as you mentioned at the start, one of the roles I play within my organization is I'm called a mental health advocate, which are ambassadors within the firm, senior leaders that the wider employees can come and talk to about mental health and well-being issues. And my journey started a few years ago, almost 5 years ago now. I was approached to become a mental health advocate, and interestingly, I was approached initially to say, there is nobody who looks like you on a mental health advocate panel. Which I must admit didn't land very well with me, because I tend to sort of bristle at the suggestion that I'm being included just because of the way I look at certain events. And interestingly, I said yes, not just purely because of that bit, and I'll come back to that in a second, but also I had not disclosed anybody at work at that point in time, but I was caring for my wife, who was going through a period of anxiety and panic attacks. And we were on a mental health journey ourselves in my personal life. And it was difficult. It was very difficult. I'm originally from Nepal. I grew up in a culture where mental health isn't talked about. in Nepali, there isn't a word for mental ill health. There's a word for crazy, but there's no, the vocabulary just doesn't exist. So it's not something you ever talk about. It's you expect to just walk things off. You expect to just hide it. And as we went through that journey, and we went into therapy, both of us did. We started understanding the importance of that support system, the support network around you. And I remember us coming out to my parents and saying to them, this is what's happening. We are taking therapy. At that point, my wife was on medications as well. And I was expecting a pretty strong backlash. Interestingly, it went the other way around. I got a huge amount of support, a huge amount of love. They were there all the way throughout the journey. And then that got me thinking of taking it back into workplace and understanding the importance of being able to bring your whole self and show who you are at work, so you can get that support not just in your personal life, but within a work context as well. And Lee, I think when you were talking about that whole self bit, that really resonated with me, because for me that is the bit where I think most organizations miss a trick. Because if you're not going to let somebody be their whole self, if they're not going to accept the good bits and the not so good bits, you're never going to get the most out of them. You can't realize their potential. So bringing it back to work, and that personal side really drove the decision. And I went, I see the benefits. I see the commercial benefits as well, going back to what Lee was saying. And I became an advocate. But I was still resistant to this idea that somehow, because of the way I look, I would be approached in a different way, or I would somehow create a ripple effect. And I must admit, over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, I've been humbled, and I'm quite happy to say I was wrong in my initial assessment. I've had more than sort of a half a dozen conversations now from people who've reached out to me. And our organization is large. We have 20,000 plus people, and I've had people reach out to me from completely different teams, completely different offices, completely different, nothing to do with me whatsoever. And the opening line tends to be, "You might understand what I'm going through." And it's that mixture of that cultural issues that people particularly from the BAME community sort of feel that they, the expectation is I would have understood that. And quite frankly, quite often I do. And that leads into some very interesting conversations. People turn up who would otherwise never have spoken to anybody at all, who might not have approached for help at all. And that's sort of making me realize that importance of that role model and the diversity of the role model has to be a key component of any workplace well-being strategy. You definitely need that, because I think it needs to sort of go from both angles. You need to have people at the top, your role models, behaving, saying the right things to create the permission, to create the culture of opening up. And by having that, you almost sort of create a pull factor, and the push factor comes in from the wider group, from your teams, who would look up and say, actually, I see somebody I relate to, and I'm happy to open up. So for me, that has now become a key part of what I do. And we recently expanded our mental health advocate community by another dozen or so people. I'm glad to sort of see the diversity of the faces and backgrounds which have come into it, and I think that's going to really help us.
So that's amazing, Abihijay. And I think the point that you make, that sometimes we resist being, so I've been in that position myself many a times. You're a woman, you've had lived experience of mental health issues. You're a BAME woman with lived experience of mental health issues. There you go. We've got 3 overlapping intersectionality issues here. And then when I put in the fact that I've actually got a long-term physical health condition as well, I mean, brilliant. I am the perfect tick box exercise. And actually that sometimes when I'm not in a great place has a big impact on my own confidence. And I question my place at the table. Am I here because of my skills, or am I here because of the overlapping intersectionality that I bring, that the organization or the meeting that I'm at can tick boxes? And I think having allies and having people that look like us, having this kind of conversation, having leaders like Lee going, actually, I don't get this, but I feel embarrassed and ashamed of the data, and I'm going to do something even though I don't feel it, makes it okay. Let me now move on and bring Will into this conversation. Will, tell us a little bit about your story. I've spent a number of conversations with you, and I've always been inspired. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Thank you, Poppy. Yeah, so I think straight off, I'm going to tell my story, but I received great support at Deloitte over a recent bereavement, and in my role currently as a carer for my mother. The firm has really been able to understand the pressures and that these events bring. And many of you know Deloitte has an agile working culture that's ensured that I've still been able to get my work done. That's very helpful to have that degree of flexibility in the workplace. That said, I do want to talk about a bit about wider society. That in my opinion, we don't seem to yet have the language to talk about caring roles or bereavement. Conversations still take place in the shadows, kind of in hushed, cautious tones. The goal is always not to upset the person we're talking to. And not surprisingly, as a society, we're much better on the happier things, on wedding engagements, marriage and kids. Secondly, I can't help reflecting that the current pandemic and the devastation in care homes is also an extension of this. Somehow there's a connection there. And I can only hope the current situation will provoke a reset on that. My third point, sort of instruction, would be, I think we also should be quite mindful of how we talk about our own experiences of lockdown. Funny enough, before this call, Lee was saying he was having a great lockdown and really enjoying it and enjoying being still, but there'll be other people who will be trapped in a single person household, living a half life and having a very tough time. I don't know about anyone else, but personally, if I see one more video of people doing press ups or baking bread or talking about self-improvement, I'm going to actually scream. Actually, I did post a picture of a sunset the other day, but so maybe I'm a bit guilty. But I think it's very important in lockdown to locate the common experience. So, for instance, the stress of homeschooling young children and the loneliness of a one-person household do actually relate to each other. I think we should look for the meeting points as we re-emerge from the lockdown. So on the 7th of January this year, my father died at 7 p.m. With all his family holding him as he took his last breath. He had had bladder cancer for a number of years, but had rapidly deteriorated in the previous 3 months, following a fall and a spell in hospital. His last months were really painful to watch as he lost his appetite, ability to wash, to move around, go to the toilet. And in the end, it was a blessing he didn't last too long. I thought at the time that you wouldn't let an animal suffer that like that for a long period. He wanted to be at home rather than hospital, but the fearful questions and the cries of agony made it a very harrowing time for me, the like of which I've never experienced before. When he had gone, I was totally, and still am, surprised by the physical absence, which nothing prepares you for. At times it feels like it felt like he was never here at all. However, there was no time to grieve for my father. His departure left me and my 2 brothers, but mainly me, as the primary carer for Mum, who at 79 is in very good physical health, but extremely poor mental health. As well as being lifetime bipolar, she's been diagnosed with dementia. She's on the highest national categorization for poor mental health, which in a strange blessing means we're eligible for NHS support. Mum typically will speak all day in a repetitive loop of nonsense. She'll repeat the same facts and stories from things that happened around 40 years ago, mixing up facts and fiction. She does at least recognize people, but she can't be fed, washed, or left alone. Unfortunately, she lashes out against those closest to her, and she could be aggressive to Dad at times, and has seen off at least 3 carers this year. Something in her condition makes her take an irrational dislike to those trying to help her and around her. In fact, we've just lost another carer who initially got on well with Mum, but 4 weeks in, suddenly cups of tea and plates were being thrown. So sadly, I took her to the station on Sunday. Mum is better now than she was 2 years ago when we had to section her, and she went through a very difficult period of running around and rampaging at night, and it was very difficult throwing objects. In many ways, she isn't really my mother anymore, but a version of her, and it can be difficult and draining to live with her. Sometimes I feel guilty that it would be easier if she wasn't around anymore, and it's a terrible feeling to have that, and I imagine that others have probably felt that too. She is alive physically, but not the same kind, caring mother that I remember growing up with. I reflect these diseases tamper with happy memories of one's own. They can reshape and destroy traditionally nurturing relationships. So I reflect, like many of you, lockdown only magnifies a situation like this or whatever we're going through. And actually I had a bit of a breakdown last week when I felt that things are really hopeless. As I don't have children of my own, I feel it more incumbent on me to support my mum than my brothers who do have children. This is very common, the good gay son taking care of the elderly parents. So in fact, maybe it's not such a curse to have an LGBT child after all. Who knew that? Like you parents out there, it's a constant worry from waking up to bedtime. Unlike that, I feel it's a story with no happy outcome. A nursing home or death is sadly the only possible conclusion. As for my own state, I find I grind my teeth from anxiety, and my dentist has given me a guard to wear at all times to help with that. I kind of feel sometimes occasionally destructive and violent, which I have to accept and keep in check and manage that. And it's hard because mum needs her routine and is very full on from 8 AM to 8 PM every day. It's also difficult in this caring role to gauge how good a job you're doing, or to find a peer group who are going through the same thing. I probably lost, I would say, parts of my life to this condition my mum has. But, you know, with your family, you have no choice. The bonds of family enable you to dig very deep, even in very dark times. And I reflect that I'm actually very lucky to have two parents who lived well into their old age. And I certainly don't regret time not spent with them. Also, there is clearly a fulfillment that comes from taking on a caring role. And I've learned a huge amount about mental health directly from mum, both about hers and my own. Like many of you, some of these responsibilities inevitably overlap into the working day. And actually, I thought really carefully about that word overlap. I chose overlap, not intrude or disrupt. I think we need to choose the word there quite carefully. I don't want it to sound negative. I get regular calls from my mum in her imaginary distress, phoning to say how much she hates her life and in her chaos. Like many of you, again, that will mean ducking into a meeting room or a quiet area in a busy office, as it was. Remember those, which is often quite hard. And I would imagine as well for any parent hearing their own child being upset, it transmits that same stress directly into you. My work, again, are incredibly supportive. The agile working culture of Deloitte really helps me manage these situations. The firm trusts us all to do work when it suits us, providing it gets done. And that responsibility is very empowering, let alone helpful at times like this. I was given all the time I needed to care for Dad at the end and organise this cremation. My line manager, and I'm going to name check her, Steph, because she is so good, and I hope she's listening. She asks me on a regular basis how I'm doing, which makes all the difference. She normalises the issue and makes me feel included in the life of the office. This is so important. So yeah, that active engagement, asking how I am, is really important. And let's just be aware that for everyone going through a positive experience in the workplace, there'll be others going through a negative caring or bereavement. I think we can create the conditions for both to coexist side by side. So I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Will.
Poppy, I don't know whether this is allowed, but may we give a round of applause to Will? I mean, phenomenal.
Yes.
Thank you.
A round of applause is very allowed, Michael. I think that's Michael.
Yeah,
Fontaine, isn't it? Yes,
it is. It is. No, there's just the bravery and courage and poignancy and just wow in that story.
Thank you. And I also want to add, Will, I'm very sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing so openly and honestly. I think it's left all of us feeling, and that's the maximum impact anybody can have. So I really appreciate that, and I want to honour the experience that you're having, and the experience that you've lived with your mum, having a severe mental health condition all of her life, and what you're going through right now. It really does bring home why this community of mental health advocates, ambassadors, leaders is so much needed now more than ever before. Thank you so much. I'm going to now move to you, Matt. Matt, you and I have shared a platform before, and it was a lot of fun. And that was back in October last year, around World Mental Health Day, I think it was. And so let me invite you to tell us about the work that you do and why it is so important from your perspective, your organization's perspective, that the banking industry, the banking sector, the financial sector take on board inclusivity in the LGBTQ+ community agenda.
Yes, thank you very much, Poppy. And just want to start by saying, Will, the thing that you just shared there was yeah, really touching. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So those of you who don't know me, my name's Matthew Cameron, as Poppy pointed out there, and I'm the sort of founder and CEO of an organisation called LGBT Great. We focus on developing the agenda specifically for the buy-side area of financial services. So we tend to work less with sort of the big banking organisations. We focus more on sort of the institutional retail asset management market, sort of private equity, hedge funds, etc., and some of the exchanges as well. And I guess we really sort of set it out on course a few years ago, because what we sort of recognised was that there was a lot of progress sort of happening around this agenda and the mental health agenda as well, perhaps in other industry sectors, but a lot less happening in sort of the area of the sort of financial services industry that we represent. And we wanted to try and sort of do something about that. We did tend to see a lot as well, we still continue to do so. Lots of people who suffer from mental health within our industry. We are an industry that's, I guess, all about, you know, high performance and being strong and being sort of macho. And I guess that is starting to change now as we start to get more sort of inclusivity sort of into sort of the workplace. I think one of the reasons it's sort of really important to me actually that we focus on LGBT and specifically mental health within the industry is just the sort of the disproportional rate in which mental health impacts the LGBT community. So, you know, I think it's around roughly sort of 81% of LGBT plus employees have experienced some form of mental health condition, with around 72% attributing sort of their mental health issues to their experience actually in work. So there's a real need here to make sure that we have that support mechanism, that visibility in place. And one of the things that we do actually through one of our programs is sort of generate and develop this sort of culture and concept of role modelship through our sort of role models programs, where people are encouraged and inspired to share their stories, you know, from an intersectional sort of perspective as well. So from our sort of programs, what we're sort of seeking to do is to try and help tell those stories as a bit of a beacon of inspiration, actually, that, you know, vulnerability and actually putting yourself out there a little bit and empathy is actually a strength as opposed to a weakness. And it's sort of trying to shift these things on the head that's been sort of impactful. But I guess going further on, just to sort of look at, you know, inclusive culture, one of the big beliefs that we have at LGBT Great, and a conversation that we try to lead, or we aim to lead with a lot of our member organisations, is actually this sort of ethos of how we get a culture of equality. And when we think about sort of diversity and inclusion, and I spend a lot of my time talking to firms about their D&I programs that tend to be sort of focused around sort of segmentation and silos into gender or LGBT, you know, or other sort of protected characteristics. And these then tend to be reinforced by specific policies for each group. And of course, you know, the human brain, it's the way that we're programmed to categorize, you know, we find safety and it's more sort of comfortable. But the point around D&I is that these categories are almost becoming absolutely sort of pathological and definitive, and it's preventing us from sort of starting to explore the other elements of our identity. So, for example, today, you know, I speak to you as a person that looks like the majority of the industry I represent, a white man. But I also speak to you as somebody who's LGBT. I speak to you as somebody that is from a really low social economic background, first in the family to go to university. You know, I was born in Blackpool and then went to university in Birmingham. Also from a family that was distinctly Catholic in sort of belief systems. And I do have my own sort of anxieties, which I've had to learn to manage. So all of those things make me who I am. Yet when somebody, and perhaps many of you today, look at me, listen to me, what you see is the white, confident, powerful, perhaps person in power, you know, and those biases are part of the problem here. So I think it's, yeah, my message to our clients, the message for today is that it's time to now shift the narrative from D&I, or the other things that organisations do. They tend to swap the words around, so we get I and D, and we think it's kind of cracked the issue. But it's now time to get under the surface, I think, in terms of the things that we don't know, so that we can explore and sort of comprehend the sort of the interconnectivity between the various identity points. And there's various things that we sort of recommend doing on that point. But for me, you know, we've got to shift the narrative from diversity and inclusion and talking in categories to start thinking more broadly about intersectionality. So hopefully, Poppy, that gives a good sort of lay into the next part of the session.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. And I'm going to encourage people to start typing questions in. I might not be able to get all of them in, but if you've got key questions, please ask. We've got another 15 minutes or so. But Matt, I'm going to come back to you in a second to explore further what recruitment practices can look like. So what you're talking about is, can we actually stop categorizing people, because whole cells are multiple maps of identity, and that becomes ridiculous, and you get caught up in a bit of a tangle on what need do we meet first, and in so doing we leave people out. But actually creating a culture of openness so that everybody, it's about the culture, isn't it, and not necessarily about the categories that we fit into. So I'm going to come back to you and ask a question around inclusive recruitment in a minute, because that is the first challenge, isn't it? Why is there not enough diversity? Why is Abihijay being picked out as the person that looks like that in that category? Because actually there isn't enough diversity. So how can we create that? But I am going to go back to Abihijay a moment. And Abihijay, let me just sort of listening to what Will was talking about and bereavement and actually the demographic that have been impacted by COVID-19 and all the narrative in the news. Have you got a view or any insights and thoughts on the health inequalities that are emerging and the people that it's impacting?
Yeah, I mean, Poppy, I think I might share some of your views on this. And funnily enough, I was discussing this with my wife yesterday as well. It's odd, isn't it, that in predominantly white countries, there has been a disproportionate impact on the physical health of the BAME communities. And you know, my immediate reaction was, well, is there something physiologically that is setting you know, BAME and non-BAME people apart? But then if you look into mortality rates in Asia, South Asia, Africa, that doesn't seem to sort of really quite gel. And for me, actually, what the epidemic has done has laid sort of stark some of the inequalities which does exist in the society, in our health system, as well. I mean, if you sort of dig into why that is the case, quite often, you know, the underlying medical conditions is the proportion of people with underlying medical condition is higher in BAME communities. It might be because of the lifestyle, it might be because of culture, it might be because of, you know, that's, you know, eating more, definitely from where I come from, is a sign of wealth. And I can totally see, you know, how that then links into a whole host of sort of other medical issues. But also space. multi-generational households are much more common. Again, in my community, you will see grandparents all the way down to grandkids all in the same house, small, living in more enclosed spaces, and then link back into jobs. And I'm extremely lucky. I can work from home. In fact, I can work from home very well. But a lot of the jobs out there which are being done by so-called frontline workers, there's a much more disproportionate sort of BAME element into that as well. So for me, there's definitely something that this has shown, and I think that really the challenge for us is how we address it. I mean, this is a generational change, generation shift. I think coming out of it, there are some big lessons to be learned. How much have we really invested in NHS being, one of the bigger questions. But for me, there's something about then addressing this inequality as well. And I don't have easy answers today, but I think if you're not able to fix that, then we have a real societal problem.
Thank you for raising all of those issues and giving us an insight into the South Asian culture. Will, I'm going to give you the last word in a minute, and I want to come back to the fact that you challenged us right at the beginning of your story about actually we don't talk enough about carers. We don't talk enough about bereavement in businesses and in the workplace. And I'd like to learn from you what good in that might look like. So if you can think about some reflections on that in a moment. Matt, I'm going to come back to you in a second. Lee, I'm going to come to you now. You've talked about your organization obviously exists in, I think it's 12 countries, can't remember, 12 country offices around the world. So you will have seen the impact on people's mental health around the world. And I also remember you talking about this fantastic story around gender equality in a culture where gender equality is far behind. I know you've made a lot of progress here in this country, but I know that actually you've done some proactive stuff in other countries to give permission for intersectionality, for inequality to be surfaced and addressed. Perhaps you could share a little bit with us, a couple of minutes on that, please.
Yeah, sure. And just a couple of things linking back into what Abihijay and Matt said. I mean, Matt's point about high performance is an interesting one for me, because lots of the conversations in other countries, and to a certain extent in the UK as well, essentially define high performance as a aggressive and macho component. And in my view, high performance absolutely can coexist with human decency, compassion, respect, and all those other softer elements, perhaps, that you don't have to make a trade-off and choice. That's often the starting point in a number of these conversations we have around the world. It's not be high-performing, macho, aggressive, 1980s style trader. Actually, you can do all of these things. High performance is not, a discrete component of I choose to be high performant or I choose to be nice and inclusive. It's one and the same thing, and it has to be. Otherwise, we won't get corporations to buy into this idea that I feel passionately about, that this is all part of creating shareholder value and societal value altogether. The second thing in the context of your question that Abihijay raises around giving permission. So the conversation I had with the leader of our business in India was around, his point to me was, I can't hit these gender targets that you're setting and deliver what you want because we work late into the night to match, the analysts match European and US market hours. And in Indian culture, it's very difficult for a woman to finish work late at night and travel home, even though we pay for taxes. They arrive at home at midnight or 1 in the morning. The neighbors are asking what's going on. It's a very difficult thing. The question for me to him was, okay, I get the fact we're not going to roll back thousands of years of culture, but maybe we should think about having a shift system, or what other commercial opportunities that the female analysts can apply themselves to that remove that issue. Trading, advising on trade ideas in Asian markets during the time zone, and we could change that model. His point was, am I allowed to do that? I thought that we always operated in this way. And that was a wake-up call for me, because it really said to me that we hadn't necessarily empowered our regional leaders to take on the overall strategic intent of what we're trying to do here and adapt their businesses accordingly. So we also had similar conversations in China about the way that female analysts often are feel reluctant in China to ask questions in front of male analysts when they're going through the education onboarding processes. Again, the point was, what are we doing about changing the way we educate and onboard people to resolve those problems, rather than just saying, well, it can't be done. So giving permission, as Abihijay pointed out, I think is really, really critical. Empower people, give them the strategic intent, and then give them some autonomy and encouragement to get on with it.
Thank you. And I think sometimes, you know, we miss that, we can miss the fact that we haven't, well, I guess different cultures operate differently. So I guess there's the cultural nuances, but sometimes it's what we haven't communicated because it seems obvious to us. And I think that was a really great example of, you know, actually it wasn't that women aren't going to engage. It's the fact that actually nobody thought about doing it differently, and actually doing it differently impacted the bottom line positively. So those things are aligned. They're never on, we're not fighting. If you do more inclusion, well-being, wellness, it doesn't go against the grain of business prosperity. And I think that sometimes it feels like a tug of war discussion, and I just don't think it is. I don't think we're thinking about it in the right way always.
It's not a trade-off or choice. That's the important thing. It's not one or the other. It's you know, a virtuous circle of support. The more inclusion, the more diversity, the more compassion, the more empathy you have in an organization, the more you build a powerful workforce behind what your strategic goals are. And if, you know, we listen to Will's amazing story, and you think about you know, the positive impact that story is having on all of us, but also within the organization that he works for, undoubtedly will have a better outcome for the performance of the company, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Matt, to you around early careers and recruitment, and how can we, what are the challenges there, and what can we seek to change within ourselves? And then I'll come back to Will before we close.
Yeah. So I guess I thought I was sort of with a quick 30 seconds. I guess, you know, my experience when I came to London from the bright lights of Lancashire back in 2009 was really difficult, actually, because I didn't have any links, didn't have any connections, didn't know what the interview crack was, and it was a tricky time. It was the wilderness and the world of the unknown, really. I then managed to get a job actually in recruitment, which I guess is why you're perhaps turning to me for this question, and that's where I started my career for the first 5 years. But certainly what I recognise from my time in recruitment and executive search is that a lot of the processes and the way that we think about what success looked like in a particular candidate or in a role is really sort of, I guess, achieved by what we see on the page, where somebody's worked, you know, what school they've been to, and that's how we make automatic decisions very, very quickly because of our default biases when we look at a page. I think when it comes to sort of graduates and sort of school leavers, there was sort of 4 points and recommendations that I'd like to quickly sort of get across there. But I think that the first thing is about making sure that there's you know, a program in place with leadership internally to understand what the sort of the barriers and the challenges are within recruitment at the moment, and actually looking at the data of where school leavers and graduates, you know, around sort of diversity are sort of coming from, and recognizing sort of the key trends, and then looking actually from there what you need to do less of or what you need to do more of. But it's got to be business owned and got to be led from an executive sort of sponsor. And the second part then around actually how do we look at intersectionality in the process is actually bringing more of the science into the recruitment process. So when we talked before about where we've been to university, what degree we've got, what classification we've got, a whole host of biases naturally form around those mechanisms. So what we've got to think about here is that, okay, we've got those, we can't actually change those mechanisms, but what we can do alongside that is enhance and facilitate by understanding other factors such as thinking preferences when it comes to sort of analysing or considering and monitoring a candidate during the process. And there's various things that organisations can do there, which are data focused. I guess the third point then is looking at actually what's our sort of outreach strategy, and making sure that within our sort of outreach channels, we are, we're building affinity and connections with, different diversity groups. And when I say diversity, I'm talking there about identity, so gender, LGBT, BAME, etc. And then making sure that there's a commonality between what you're assessing between all of those groups. But obviously there's different ways in which you can assess each of those criteria. So I guess it's about having a bit of a matrix approach with the outreach strategy, sort of with the things that you're looking to review during the process. And then the fourth point, which is perhaps the obvious one, is strategic thinking and taking more time to actually achieve an outcome in recruitment. Typically, it's a very transactional and fastest finger first time to hire process. So I think having that time and having that strategic thinking and planning in place, so it's more strategic as opposed to reactive, is another sort of key point. So they're the 4 points that I think we can do to bring intersectionality into the recruitment process.
Really clearly highlighted, Matt, and thank you very much. And I think what we might do, Kate, if that's okay, is note down the 4 points that Matt's identified and put it in the write-up for this session to our colleagues. I've also noticed there's one question for Abihijay on lessons to note for getting mental health advocates in the organisations. I'm not going to answer that here, but Abihijay, we'll pick your brains on that and we'll add that to the document that we sent through. So Will, last few words from you on the challenge that you posed and how can we work together to address?
Thank you, Poppy. Yeah, a couple of points. I think you've talked about mental health ambassadors and advocates just now. I think having those at all levels. So Deloitte very good at having mental health ambassadors, so not just the very senior levels, but also all levels. So you don't have to be intimidated to have a conversation about mental health. I think that's worked really well, and that's working very well at the firm. I think I was very inspired by your last event where you had senior leaders, senior women talking about their own experiences, and I think that kind of openness and transparency is very good. But I think finally, I would just say generally, just be less scared of having a conversation with someone who is either gone through a bereavement, or because the impact will be felt for years afterwards, not just the week or 2 a month after the event, and make it part of the normal conversation. Don't be too worried about upsetting people. They'll be pleased you asked. It should be normal. And I think the lockdown's given us a great chance to do that. I mean, yes, keep baking bread and keep doing the sourdough, but also let's talk about the other stuff as well, because I think that'll be a really net positive for the whole experience when we re-emerge.
Thanks, Will. So just to say, you sum up what you've just said, is essentially let's all of us keep talking. Let's do the positive things and highlight and promote this, because actually positive psychology, positive influence is each other in a different way. But let's not deny some of the really tough challenges that many of us are going through, and let's honor those experiences. And actually, in terms of changing workplace culture, how do we do that on a more regular, open way? Because bereavement is something that our society is going to have to, as a whole, heal from, as in not just in this country, but globally. So it's something that we need to get familiar with in terms of the way that we speak about it and be compassionate towards each other and ourselves. I'm going to end on that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you very much to our speakers for being absolutely brilliant. And I'll take care, look after yourselves, and I'll see you all soon.